Shabbat Shalom. This is Daniel John Lee with Torah Restoration Ministries, and this is my weekly Shabbat podcast. Today's podcast is episode 20, Ephesians chapter 2. Again, this comes off of a teaching that you can read in my teaching section on my website, www.spiritandtorah.com. On the left-hand side, click on Teachings, and you will find Ephesians 2 explained toward the top. We're going to start in Ephesians 2, starting in verse 11, where it says, "Wherefore remember, that ye being in times past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision, by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh made by hand, that at that time ye were without Messiah, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without Yahweh in the world." Stop there. Okay, so Ephesians 2 has a very basic theme, very basic premise. And basically what Paul is saying is, hey, look, you believers who are once called Gentiles, and that's the past tense, you were once called Gentiles, implying that you're no longer thought of or considered a Gentile, but now you are considered an Israelite. You're considered a Hebrew. You were once estranged from the covenant of promises. Now, what is that? What is the covenants of promise? Well, my friends, the covenants of promise are all the jots and tittles in the Torah, along with serving Israel's Yahweh. Now, you say, well, how can you say that the Torah is what Paul refers to when he says the covenants of promise? Because if you look at the Torah, the Torah is a covenant, okay? It's a covenant. It's a binding agreement between two parties, Yahweh and his people Israel, and it contains promises. For example, if you honor your father and mother, you are given the promise that you will have long life. If you keep the commandments, the Torah, you are promised to have none of these diseases from Egypt touching you. So for every time you keep the precepts contained within the covenant, within Torah, you are given promises or a promise. So that's why the Torah is the covenants of promise. That's what it is. When Paul says covenants of promise, he's referring to the Torah of Israel. Continuing on, it says, "But now in Yahshua HaMashiach, you who were sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Messiah." Okay, so Paul says, look, you were once Gentiles, you were once estranged, you were aliens, you were not a part of the commonwealth of Israel, you were strangers from the covenants of promise, from the Torah, having no hope, without Yahweh in the world. But through the blood of Messiah, that estrangement from the Torah, from Israel, from all the covenants of promise, from the jots and tittles of Torah, has been abolished. That means that we get to serve the Yahweh of Israel. We get to serve and obey the Torah of Israel. We get to be partakers of the commonwealth of Israel. We are heirs of the covenants of promise. We can now keep the whole Torah, just as the rest of the believing Jews. For the blood of Messiah paves our way to do so. Now, the Bible does not change. Yahweh himself, who commissioned his people to write the Bible, he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So what we're reading about in Ephesians 2 is nothing new. This was the same rule in the Mosaic covenant. Remember Rahab the harlot. Remember Ruth the Moabitess. Remember the Egyptians who left with Israel from Egypt and were part of the mixed multitude under Moshe and Aaron. Remember these examples of pagan Gentiles throughout the Tanakh. And because they chose to place their faith in the coming Messiah and has not yet shed blood, they were grafted into Israel and were no longer considered Gentiles. But they were considered one with Israel. And when they were considered one with Israel, when they were grafted in, they were expected and required to keep every last jot and tittle of the Torah, just as if they had been born in Israel from day one. So this provision was in the Torah, and we're reading about that same provision now here in Ephesians 2. Ephesians 2 shows us that this provision in Torah to allow Gentiles to become Israelites, to allow them to become Hebrews, this provision never passed away. Yahweh is the same yesterday, today, and forever. We continue on in Ephesians 2. For he is our peace, who has made us both one, and has broken down the middle wall of partition between us. In other words, through Messiah, we are all considered Israelites now, and thus we are all required to obey the Torah given to Israel. There is no class warfare, no exclusivity that the wicked Pharisaical Jews tried to establish, but rather the written Torah is clear that a Gentile may be grafted in Israel, and that once the Gentile is grafted in by the blood of Messiah, he is no longer considered a Gentile, but he is now a fellow Israelite, also expected to obey the precepts in Torah, to become part of the covenants of promise. The partition was destroyed by Torah, and now that Torah has been sprinkled in Yahshua's blood, we are reminded that this partition is still destroyed. Remember, back in the Tanakh, when Moshe, when he first gave the book of the law, the Torah, to the people, what did he do? Before he gave it to them, he sprinkled the book in blood. He took the blood of the slain animal. He sprinkled that book with the blood, and then he sprinkled the people with the blood. This was a foreshadow of what Yahshua would do by spilling his blood on the cross. So we're talking about the same thing. Moshe taking that blood and sprinkling the book, the Torah, and then sprinkling the people is the same. It foreshadows the event that we look back now as when Yahshua himself was crucified and spilled his blood for us. And what does this do? We continue to read in Ephesians 2, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even against the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make himself of twain one new man, so making peace. Now, people get tripped up by this verse, thinking, "Oh, look, he abolished in his flesh the law of commandments." No, he abolished in his flesh the enmity against the law of commandments contained in ordinances. So, in other words, we had a natural enmity as Gentiles. As unregenerated people, we had a natural enmity toward the Torah, toward the commandments. Well, he abolished that. He abolished that enmity that we had. He abolished the enmity that we had toward the Torah. The enmity is not the law. The law is not evil. The law is holy and righteous and just, according to Apostle Paul. Where the evil comes in is our enmity, our natural enmity against the Torah, against the law that we all have before we fall in love with Yahweh. But that enmity is removed by the cross. The shed blood of his atonement should cause our hearts to break as we realize the love he's given to us, so that we no longer have enmity against the ordinances and the laws written in Torah. Okay? If this verse is actually saying that Yahweh, through his flesh, abolished the Torah, the commandments, then that means we can go murder and we can go commit adultery and we can steal, because those are all ordinances found in the Torah. And of course, that doesn't make any sense. We are redeemed by Yahshua's blood, right? So another thing that he has put to death is that the commandments, the ordinances, no longer condemn us. There is condemnation that is brought upon an individual if he is not in compliance with Torah. That condemnation that Torah brings is abolished, is destroyed. And why? Why is it destroyed? Is it because the Torah changes? No. It's because we change. It's because through the blood of Messiah and his redemptive work, we now have the power to obey everything in Torah. We get this internal power from our precious Messiah and the indwelling of his Ruach HaKadosh. His Spirit teaches us to keep his commandments, to keep the law. And because we keep the law, we no longer disobey Torah. So, remember, Ephesians 2 very, very clearly teaches us that through the blood of Messiah, we are now considered Israelites, Hebrews. We are no longer considered Gentiles. That we now have the power to obey the Torah. Because we have the power to obey the Torah no longer condemns us, nor do we have enmity toward the Torah any longer. Shabbat Shalom. Obey the Torah.